8:34 p.m., Christmas Eve. Snow fell outside Northgate Market. Daniel Walker, 39, a single dad, clutched his grocery bag after a long, exhausting shift. He was mentally counting his change, barely enough for their meager dinner with his daughter. The biting wind cut through his thin jacket. A frail woman approached, gripping two 5-year-old twins. Shivering, she asked, "Could you spare us food?" The children watched his bread with silent, desperate yearning. A customer snapped, "Go away! This isn't a shelter!" Daniel froze, the words echoing the cold. The truth behind these three broken people would shatter every belief he held. Daniel's mind was a flurry of numbers and logistics, a constant mental ledger of a single father surviving month to month. He was calculating the cost of the bread versus the cost of Lucy's new school shoes when the small, apologetic voice cut through the noise of the snow and traffic. He knelt immediately, dropping his single grocery bag onto the slush-covered sidewalk, scattering a few flakes of snow onto the bread inside. He brought himself level with the twin children, two tiny identical figures whose faces were pale and pinched with cold and hunger. He spoke softly, consciously keeping his voice steady, trying to minimize the embarrassment and fear that radiated from the mother. He tried to ignore the angry customer, a man in a pristine parka who was now muttering behind him about freeloaders and the nerve of some people. But the judgmental murmurs still stung. "Have you had dinner, little ones?" he asked, focusing purely on the twins. The two children shook their heads slowly, eyes wide and completely void of the usual sparkle one expected on Christmas Eve. The mother, Maria, lowered her face in profound shame, pulling her threadbare coat tighter around her small frame. Her hands were visibly red, chapped from exposure and overuse. "Please, I apologize for intruding," she explained in a quiet, apologetic rush. She explained that they had been evicted from their temporary rental just hours earlier, unable to pay the last 2 nights' rent after a temporary cleaning job fell through. They had been walking aimlessly for hours, trying to find a warm ATM vestibule, but the children hadn't eaten anything substantial since lunch. A slice of shared bread and water. Daniel's heart twisted violently in his chest. His mind instantly pictured his own daughter, 8-year-old Lucy, waiting for him at home. He imagined her hunger, her confusion, her fear if he didn't return. The internal conflict was immediate and fierce. He looked at the single bag of groceries he held, the food meant for his simple but non-negotiable Christmas Eve meal with Lucy. A loaf of bread, cheap cheese, and a small box of instant hot cocoa. He hesitated for exactly one painful second, a flash where his duty to Lucy battled his impulse to save. Then decisively, he pushed the entire grocery bag into Maria's hands. The arrogant man who had yelled earlier scoffed loudly as he passed Daniel, adjusting the expensive watch on his wrist. "Saving the world now, are we, Walker? Hope you still have enough for your own kid." Daniel didn't raise his voice, but his reply was flat and calm, filled with a quiet dignity that cut through the chaos of the night. "I'm just not starving children." It was a simple statement of moral non-negotiation. Daniel guided Maria and the twins into a recessed corner by the loading dock, shielded slightly from the biting wind. The minute the bag was opened, the children began eating the bread immediately, ravenously, their small, cold fingers tearing at the soft crust. Yet even in their desperate hunger, they paused, chewing slowly, to offer Daniel a polite, solemn thank you through mouthfuls. It was a gesture of inherent dignity that Daniel hadn't expected, and it amplified his pain. These children hadn't lost their manners, only their security. He learned the mother's name was Maria, and the twins were named Leo and Lily. Maria, finding a brief moment of warmth, began to talk, her voice gaining strength, though still apologetic. "I didn't want to ask. I wouldn't have. I promise you, Mr. Walker. I've always worked. I couldn't bear to look at their faces anymore. They were so silent. I couldn't stand the silence of their hunger." With the last of his spare change, the money he had explicitly reserved for Lucy's small annual Christmas ornament, a tradition they held sacred, Daniel walked to a nearby coffee stand. He bought them 3 cups of piping hot milk, ignoring the pain of knowing he would have to explain to Lucy why there was no ornament this year, The warm milk seemed to thaw some of the terror and tension from the children's faces. Lily even managed a small, genuine smile that instantly melted Daniel's defensive walls. Just then, his phone buzzed violently in his pocket, making him jump. It was Lucy, calling for the third time, asking why he was late. Daniel spoke into the phone, turning his back slightly to Maria, his voice a strained, guilt-ridden whisper. He told Lucy a small, necessary lie, the kind of lie born of goodness. Daddy's helping someone who needs it more right now, sweetheart. Just a quick engine fix. I'll be home soon. As he clicked off the phone, he felt the heavy weight of his sacrifice, both financial and emotional. He knew he couldn't leave them on the street. Maria watched him, her eyes tracking his movements. As Daniel turned to suggest they find a shelter, Maria reached out and touched his sleeve lightly, her fingers barely grazing the rough cotton of his jacket. Her words were a final, poignant beat in the cold night, a confession that marked the beginning of Daniel's change. "You're the only person who stopped for us tonight," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "Everyone else just saw a problem to avoid." Daniel realized he hadn't just given them food, he had given them visibility. Daniel knew he couldn't leave Maria, Leo, and Lily to face the sub-zero temperatures. He insisted on driving them to the nearest emergency overnight shelter, a long drive across town to the Municipal Emergency Services building. The car ride was a tense, silent capsule of shared anxiety, broken only by the gentle sound of the heater humming and Maria's continuous, mumbled apologies. "I am so sorry for intruding on your holiday. I am so sorry for taking up your time," she repeated, her gratitude laced with deep, ingrained self-reproach. Daniel gently steered the conversation, trying to understand her situation, asking why she couldn't reach out to family or friends for support. Maria fell silent for a long, agonizing moment, staring out at the passing streetlights reflected on the snow. Her answer, when it came, was barely audible and carried the desolate weight of years of deliberate isolation. "My family believes I am dead." Daniel flinched, startled by the unexpected, profound statement. He pulled the car over briefly, needing to look directly at her. Maria explained her devastating past, her history unfolding slowly, punctuated by deep, shaky breaths. She had been Maria Thompson, a respected registered nurse at St. Anne's Hospital, earning a good living and actively pursuing advanced certification. She had stability, respect, and a future. But everything imploded when she learned she was pregnant with twins. Her husband, a successful but emotionally volatile man, instantly abandoned her, refusing to acknowledge the children. The shock and stress of the abandonment, combined with the extreme demands of a high-risk twin pregnancy, caused her to suffer a severe nervous breakdown. She was forced to take an extended, unpaid leave of absence, which eventually led to her losing her stable job. Once Leo and Lily were born, without a support network, she rapidly spiraled downward. She lost her apartment, her savings vanished paying for childcare and temporary medical bills, and then, most painfully, the legal system, seeing only her financial instability and lack of resources, stripped her of her full custodial rights. She was only permitted supervised visits, a bureaucratic cruelty that treated her as a secondary parent simply because she was poor. Daniel listened, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his chest aching with the cruelty of it all. He understood financial hardship, but this systemic, crushing failure of support, designed to protect but only serving to suffocate, was an entirely different kind of evil. They arrived at the shelter, a large, dimly lit municipal building that radiated cold, institutional indifference. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The place looked less like a haven and more like a holding cell. Daniel led them inside. The shelter volunteer at the registration desk, a tired, procedural woman named Carol, regarded them with weary neutrality. Carol shook her head after briefly examining the printouts of Maria's file. She spoke softly, yet her words held institutional finality. "I'm sorry, sir. These three cannot be registered tonight. The mother's custodial paperwork is complex and requires legal verification during business hours. We cannot house minors overnight with a parent who lacks full, unrestricted custody." The bureaucratic language was a clean veneer over a brutal reality. Maria instantly panicked, her previous composure shattering into frantic, desperate fear. She knew this policy meant she would be separated from her children, sent to the women's wing while the twins were placed in children's emergency services, a system she was terrified of losing them to forever. She started pleading hysterically, begging Carol, afraid of the very system that had already taken so much from her. Daniel felt a white-hot wave of protective rage. He stepped forward instantly, his body physically blocking Leo and Lily from the volunteers' view. His voice, though quiet, was firm and resonant, drawing the attention of the few other people waiting in the lobby. "Nobody is separating these children on Christmas Eve," he stated, his jaw set. Carol, the volunteer, stiffened, visibly uncomfortable with the confrontation, clinging rigidly to the shelter's regulations. "Sir, I understand, but policy is policy. We risk liability." Daniel cut her off, his voice rising slightly. "You risk liability? I guarantee you risk a moral failure if you send a mother away from her children tonight." Just as the tension peaked, both twins began coughing violently, a deep, rattling, painful sound that spoke not only of cold exposure, but the deep nutritional stress they had endured. The sound cut through the bureaucratic silence like a knife. Daniel's focus shifted instantly from the paperwork argument to the immediate, physical human need. He quickly stripped off his heavy winter coat, his only true piece of winter gear, and wrapped it tightly around the three of them, Maria, Leo, and Lily, sharing his only real protection from the sub-zero temperatures. He stood there in just his thin, oil-stained work shirt, suddenly vulnerable to the cold. But his resolve was iron. The volunteer, seeing the children's distress and Daniel's genuine sacrificial act, backed away slightly, momentarily losing her rigid adherence to the rules. Maria looked at Daniel through blurring tears. Her voice was raw with guilt and desperation, the cliffhanger she had promised him hours earlier coming to a head. "You shouldn't be helping me. The truth is far worse," she warned him again, pushing him away from a disaster only she knew could hurt him too. "You don't understand what I did to survive." The terrible warning hung in the air, a sword of Damocles threatening to drop all of Maria's terrible secrets. Standing in the cold, echoing corner of the shelter lobby, Daniel urged her to tell him, needing to know the full extent of the nightmare before he could fight it. Maria finally broke down, confessing the unbearable truth she had carried in secret, a shame deeper than homelessness. Her eyes were fixed on the worn gray tiles of the floor, unable to meet Daniel's steady gaze. She admitted that, nearly a year ago, when she was utterly destitute, running out of options, and her children were just 4 years old, she had made a catastrophic, unforgivable choice. "I gave the twins to someone else," she choked out, the words laced with agony, each one a self-inflicted wound. "I was promised a temporary roof, a safe place for me to sleep, and food for them, in exchange for handing them over for just a few days. They said they were a nice religious family. I was freezing. I was starving. I couldn't protect them anymore." Daniel felt a sickening lurch in his stomach, a visceral reaction to the devastating weight of that transaction. A desperate mother trading her most precious asset, her children, for her own momentary survival. "I went back for them the next morning," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. "They were gone. The people vanished. They took my babies." The twins had only been returned to her a week ago by an anonymous person, dropped off in a dark parking lot near a church, severely malnourished, silent, and deeply traumatized. Their condition had deteriorated significantly in the hands of strangers. Daniel was utterly paralyzed by the confession. The anger, the disgust, the pity. It was a maelstrom of conflicting, churning emotions. Yet strangely, his purest, fiercest fury wasn't directed at Maria, the woman who had traded her kids. It was aimed squarely at the societal structure, the cold, unforgiving system that had slowly and methodically stripped away all her options, forcing a mother into that unthinkable, impossible choice between their life and her own sanity. He erupted, the sound echoing in the cavernous, cold, tiled lobby, startling everyone. "You ask for identification. You ask for rules. You ask for proof of stability. But who is asking what these children need right now? Tonight on Christmas Eve. The lobby fell into stunned, absolute silence. Every tired face, every weary volunteer, every person seeking shelter. They all stared at Daniel, a single, weary, coatless man, his voice raw with pure moral outrage, shouting against the vast, impenetrable indifference of the system. Daniel felt the cold seeping into his shirt, but he didn't care. He was fighting for Maria's humanity. A shelter manager, a large man named Mr. Thompson, emerged from an office, moving decisively toward Daniel, reaching for his phone to call security, his face set in an expression of grim, procedural authority. Daniel swung his arm out, not touching the manager, but pointing a shaking finger directly at the hungry, cold children huddled at Maria's feet. If there is a rule that dictates these children must go hungry and cold on Christmas Eve, he declared, his voice ringing with unassailable moral authority, then the rule is fundamentally wrong, and I will not obey it. You can call the police, but you will explain to them why you let two 5-year-olds freeze while their mother begged for a bed. The manager paused, momentarily stunned by the sheer force of Daniel's moral stance and the public spectacle he was creating. But just as the conflict reached its peak, a sudden, miraculous interruption occurred. The elderly woman, wrapped in a thick shawl, who had been sitting quietly and observing everything in the corner, suddenly rose and recognized Maria. Her voice trembled with shock, but also with deep certainty. "You are the nurse from St. Anne's Hospital. Maria Thompson, you saved my grandson's life during that devastating flu epidemic last year." Maria collapsed onto the floor, the unexpected recognition dissolving her last, fragile vestige of self-control. She was no longer just an unnamed homeless woman. She was Maria, a hero forced into the shadows. The manager's expression instantly crumbled, the authority draining from his face as he realized the weight and identity of the person they were trying to summarily evict. The elderly woman, whose name was Eleanor Vance, hurried to Maria, helping her stand. Eleanor had a quiet but powerful presence that immediately commanded the room. She was well-dressed and clearly recognized. She didn't hesitate. At your work, Eleanor pulled out a small old-fashioned cell phone, the kind that held excellent reception, and dialed a number instantly. She spoke urgently into the receiver, her voice filled with a commanding urgency. "It's Eleanor. You need to drop everything and come back into the city. I have Nurse Maria Thompson here, the one who worked 3 straight days without rest to save Timmy when the epidemic hit hardest. She needs a pro bono lawyer tonight to fight for her custodial rights and file an injunction against the state. Yes, tonight. It's a Christmas miracle, but she's freezing in a shelter lobby." Daniel stood frozen, witnessing the incredible, rapid, and complete shift in Maria's fate. All because a simple, heroic act of kindness years ago had been remembered by the right person at the exact right time. He saw the profound, long-term impact of compassion, the echo of goodness returning to save its source. The two little twins, Leo and Lily, sensing the sudden, powerful protection surrounding their mother, ran to Daniel, clinging to his legs. "Please don't go, mister," they whispered, bearing their cold faces into his trousers. Daniel turned his face away from the lobby, his own profound exhaustion and the crushing pain of Maria's suffering finally breaking his stoicism. Tears streamed silently down his cheeks. Daniel understood in that powerful moment that kindness wasn't a magic cure that instantly solved all problems. It was merely the key that opened the long-locked door, allowing the crushing weight of the truth and the possibility of rescue to finally step into the light. Under Eleanor's forceful, discreet intervention, and with the immediate action of the pro bono lawyer who arrived within the hour, the shelter was forced to grant Maria and her children temporary emergency stay for 24 hours only, pending the emergency injunction filing. Daniel knew that 24 hours of cold, bureaucratic neutrality was not enough for these children. He waited until the lawyer confirmed the initial paperwork, and then, ignoring Maria's renewed protests, he offered his own small, cramped apartment for the night. "They need a soft bed and warmth that isn't institutional," he insisted. He drove them back through the silent, snow-covered streets to his side of town. When they arrived at his tiny third-floor walk-up, The air of tension and exhaustion finally began to dissipate. His daughter Lucy, 8 years old and filled with the innocent, pure spirit of Christmas, was waiting for him. She took one look at the twin children, their pale faces and tired eyes, and her immediate instinctual reaction was one of pure empathy. "They must be cold," she declared. She immediately embraced the twins, Leo and Lily, drawing them into the warm living room. "You guys can sleep in my room. We'll have a sleepover. I have an extra blanket with unicorns," she declared, her eyes bright with excitement, utterly oblivious to their trauma and financial poverty. Maria watched the genuine acceptance, the instant, uncomplicated connection between the children, and she wept silently, tears of exhaustion and gratitude mixing together. It was the first time she had seen her children play freely in nearly a year. The late dinner was pitifully simple, shared between 5 people in the tiny space, shared leftover pasta, the bread Daniel had given them earlier, and the last of Lucy's hot cocoa mix. Daniel apologized quietly to Lucy for the meager meal and the intrusion on their tradition. Lucy simply hugged him tightly, squeezing the apology out of him. "I have enough, Daddy," she insisted, her words carrying a wisdom beyond her years, a silent lesson that Daniel had himself just learned. "We have company." After the small meal, Maria sat on the rug, her back against the sofa, and told the children stories. Not sad stories, but complex, warm tales from her memory, including a funny story about a clumsy nurse in a hospital. Daniel stood outside the closed bedroom door, listening to the gentle, rhythmic sound of her voice, his heart heavy with the realization of all the joy that had been stolen from her life. He reflected deeply on his own life, wondering how many Mariahs he had missed, how many silent tragedies he had walked past, while obsessing over his own small debts and counting his own small change. Maria emerged later, her eyes still red, but steadier now, her shoulders losing some of their perpetual tension. She saw Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the frost on the window. She approached him, her face etched with profound thankfulness. "Daniel," she said softly, "I can't thank you enough, but please, you don't have to carry us. We can go back to the shelter tomorrow." Daniel looked up at her, his expression resolute. "I don't carry," he corrected her, his voice low and firm. "I stay." His commitment wasn't about financially solving her impossible problems. It was about providing the stable, human presence she had been violently robbed of. He was offering a space of unconditional human grace. Later that night, long after everyone was asleep, Daniel went into the living room to turn off the lights. He found a small piece of paper taped high on the spindly, flimsy Christmas tree he and Lucy had decorated. Lucy's messy but clear and deliberate handwriting was visible in the faint street lamp glow. It read, "No one eats alone." Daniel stared at the note, recognizing the pure, unfiltered essence of the Christmas spirit distilled by his daughter, and realized he hadn't taught her this. She had taught it to him. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, painting the small apartment in a pristine, hopeful light. The snow had stopped. The tiny apartment, which usually felt claustrophobic, was instead filled with the vibrant, precious sound of 3 children's laughter. Maria received the crucial call from Eleanor's legal team. The initial injunction had been granted, the custodial filings had been completed, and her case was officially reopened with powerful pro bono support. The legal status of Leo and Lily was, for the first time in a year, secure. She trembled, tears of profound relief and exhaustion streaming down her face. She walked to Daniel sitting at the kitchen table and hugged him fiercely, the depth of her gratitude encompassing not just the food and the shelter, but the restored hope. Daniel shook his head, looking past her to the children playing happily. "It wasn't me," he said, his voice husky with emotion and humility. "It's because you fought. It's because you never gave up on your children, even when the world told you to." Their brief shared moment of deep connection was quickly followed by action. The legal team had arranged for Maria to be immediately transferred to an official, tailored support center equipped with counseling, childcare resources, and job placement assistance, a necessary structured step toward her complete independence. Before they left, the five of them gathered for one last, small, quick breakfast. Lucy, ever the host, held the twins' hands tightly. "We're friends now," she announced to Leo and Lily, cementing the bond of one night of shared hardship and kindness. Daniel stood watching, his heart filled with a mix of warmth for the future and an aching pain for the past year of Maria's suffering. He realized that a single meal or a single coat was never enough, but a single person staying, providing unwavering presence and belief, was everything. The true miracle wasn't the handout, it was the reawakening of dignity and hope in a broken soul. Maria gathered her few possessions. As they stepped onto the icy walkway, she paused, turning back to Daniel one last time, her expression clear and resolute. Her final words to him were the most meaningful, containing the deep, painful lesson he had actually learned that night, a truth that transcended simple charity. "You didn't save us, Daniel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion but steady. "You reminded me I am a mother." She wasn't thanking him for fixing her life. She was thanking him for seeing her true, resilient self. Daniel watched them drive away, the three of them bundled safely in Eleanor's large SUV. Later that day, Daniel and Lucy decorated their small, humble Christmas tree once more. They carefully hung a new, empty, simple stocking near the fireplace. It wasn't one of the old ones they owned. Lucy asked curiously, "What's that for, Daddy?" "We already have ours." Daniel smiled, pulling her close. The painful lesson of Maria's struggle now a quiet, resolved strength that had replaced his old anxieties. "It's for the person who will need it next year, Luce," he replied. "It's a reminder that we always have a little extra room at our table." Daniel realized the greatest gift he received at Christmas wasn't money or recognition, but the permanent shattering of his indifference, replaced by an awareness of the silent suffering all around him. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to NL Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.